Okay, good morning. Boker tov, everybody. Still say Shavua Tov on a Monday morning. Just a quick announcement. We have a very, very busy week this week, as you're all aware. Busy week next week with Rosh Hashanah, but there is a number of events coming up and learning opportunities. Wednesday night we'll be at Nitzanim for those who are interested. I'll be speaking there about Rabbi Wine once again, talking about in the context of tshuva. And a Thursday afternoon, they'll be here. You don't have to go very far. It's local. We have a Yom Yom Thursday afternoon starting at 4:15, I believe it is, taking us all the way to Mincha. 3 speakers. Promises to be a very, very informative, enjoyable, and enriching afternoon. So please join us. Okay. We are talking today about Rosh Hashanah. This is the weekly Tzurba Marabanan shiur, taking a break from Hilchot Shabbat to learn about Hilchot Rosh Hashanah. Again, just a reminder, next week will be Erev Rosh Hashanah, so there will not be a shiur. The following week, there will be a shiur dealing with Yom Kippur during a Sept Tshuva, and then we will be on a break until after the Chagim. So that's the order of things. But we have a section, again, I didn't get the books because it's in volume 3, so you'll forgive me for once again. But dealing with some of the halachot on Rosh Hashanah, again, the primary mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, and we'll talk about, maybe try and look at some aspects we've not yet covered, of Tkiyat Shofar. As we know, Rosh Hashanah is called in the Torah Yom Truah, meaning there's an idea, that this is not just, it's called a Yom Truah. It's not just that there is an action and there is a mitzvah specifically of the day where you blow the shofar, but there's something about the shofar, the Tkiyat Shofar, that really signifies the essence of the whole day. It's a Yom Truah. It has halachic ramifications as well. One of the things we've spoken about and we'll touch on is the number of shofar blasts. There's a question which many of the Rishonim and the Achronim ask, which is, if the Torah said that we have to have X number of blasts, how can we go and add and add and add and add? Don't we have a principle of Baal Tosef? We can't add on, we cannot add mitzvot, we cannot add extra things. So there are different answers that are given. There are those that say, Baal Tosef applies when you have an existing mitzvah and you add on details. For example, if a person took tzitzit and added on, 5 corners onto a garment instead of, added on extra strings or something like that, that would be Baal Tosef. Or if you were to put an extra parasha in your tefillin, right, that would be, that is one answer that's given. But when you just perform a mitzvah a number of times, that is not. Other answers as well. There are those who say, if we decided on our own to go along and add in extra tkiyot, that would be one thing. But if Chachamim came and it's an established custom or minhag, etc., that's something else. But there are those who say, Torah said Yom Truah. Yom Truah means the entire day is a day of Truah. Whenever you blow the shofar as many times as you like on Rosh Hashanah, perhaps that is for form of the mitzvah. So we'll see how that plays out as well. Again, it's very interesting. Everything about Rosh Hashanah is hidden. It's very cryptic. Nothing is said explicitly. The term Rosh Hashanah does not appear in the Torah, as we know. Probably the most common way we refer to Rosh Hashanah and refer to Yom Hadin. That is not mentioned anywhere either. How do we know that Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah. What all is called, it's called Yom HaTruah, and it's called Yom HaZikaron. Where does the concept of din and judgment come from as well? So if you want to know more about that, you have to come back on, when did we say? Wednesday. We'll be talking more about that there. But it's called Yom Truah. And again, even more fascinating is that the shofar is not mentioned explicitly in the context of Rosh Hashanah. What does Yom Truah mean? Yom Truah could mean a day that you cry. It could mean a day that you blow trumpets. Who says that it's a shofar? So that we'll see as well. And it's really, really fascinating that all these things are not said explicitly. And the Gemara that we've quoted many times, and we know that where the Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah says, why do we blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah? Why do we blow the shofar? Because the Torah said, blow the shofar. The Torah didn't say blow the shofar. So that's an interesting point. What we really have twice in the Torah, we have the mitzvah of blowing a shofar. Once is in Pashat Emor, in Sefer Vayikra, the pasuk says, Daber al bnei Yisrael emor, b'chodesh hashvi'i, be'echad lachodesh, yelachem Shabbaton zichron truah mikra kodesh. Okay, that is where, you're right, here in this text, they've translated it as a shofar blast. As I said, it does not actually say shofar anywhere. It just says, zichron, there it says zichron truah. By the way, later on, there's another pasuk in Bamidbar talking about Rosh Hashanah, where it says also, b'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh, of course, observed many times. Only the Jewish people could begin the year in the 7th month, right? That's something interesting to think about as well. Right? So in one place it says Yom Trua, in one place it says Zichron Trua. This is a thought of the Bavli, and it's really the conclusion of the Yerushalmi that says that Zichron Trua relates to Shabbat, and Yom Trua relates to on a weekday. Nowadays, we don't blow the shofar when it falls out on Shabbat. It's not relevant this year, but whether that's Torah or Rabbanan, so there is an idea that maybe the Torah was alluding to it when it said Zichron Trua as opposed to Yom Trua. Be that as it may, those are the two sources that we have of Rosh Hashanah being a Yom Trua. We'll see shortly how we know that a Yom Trua translates to the shofar. But the Sefer HaChinuch has an interesting introduction here in terms of what the purpose of the shofar is. We've already discussed it previously about the Rambam. The Rambam writes and he writes it in Ilchot Shuvah, not in Ilchot Rosh Hashanah, but he writes in Ilchot Shuvah, why do we blow the shofar? He says there is a Gzerat HaKatov, the Torah said so, right? But there is a remez, there is a hint telling us to awaken. So the Sefer HaChinuch writes as follows. He says, Mishol Shea Mitzvah, Levi Sh'adam Bar Chomer, Lo Yitol Dvarim Ki Em Al Yadei Me'olel. Essentially, man is a physical being, is made up of chomer. We're trying to take abstract things, without any physical sort of reminder to hang on to. It becomes very, very difficult. He says, "Lo yit'oler ledvarim kim al yedei me'oler." We need something to awaken us. We need some sort of object. We need some sort of physical manifestation. Kaderech bnei adam et milchama, just like people when they go into war. Yaliu, af yatzlichu, they'll blow the shofar, they'll shout, they'll make a loud noise, in order to properly motivate those going out to war. וגם כן ביום ראש השנה, שהוא היום הנועד מקדם לדון בו כל באי העולם. So too, on Rosh Hashanah, we need to arouse ourselves. This is the day that was set aside to judge all creatures, right? Kol ba'ei olam. As I said, that's not written anywhere in the Chumash, but it does say so in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says, Kol ba'ei olam ovrin lefanav kivnei malom, that everybody in the world, Jews and non-Jews, are judged on Rosh Hashanah in terms of what will be. Okay. Therefore, everybody needs to arouse their nature in order to ask for mercy for their sins from the Master of Mercy. For those, he will forgive those who return with all their hearts. The sound of the shofar will awaken the hearts of all those who hear it. So why does it say tru'ah, not just shofar? Because there's something more. It's hearing the sound of the shofar is not enough. It's the fact that it is a tru'ah. That is the centerpiece of the shofar that we blow in Rosh Hashanah. It is a broken sound. It's the sound of crying. It's not just that we blow the shofar, but it has to be the broken sound as well. He says there is a hint here as well. When you hear the sound that is broken, so you need to go and you need to break the Yetzer Hara, so to speak. By the way, the Sefer HaChinuch here, he does talk about asking for mercy and asking for sins, etc. It's well known as well. We'll talk about this more, I think, on Wednesday also. But on Rosh Hashanah, we don't mention any of these things explicitly. We don't really phrase our prayers in the way of asking for mercy. A little bit, but not so much more on Yom Kippur, and certainly throughout Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and Slichot. We don't mention Chataim, we don't mention Vidui. There is absolutely no confession on Rosh Hashanah, which is very strange. Rosh Hashanah is the first 2 days of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. We would have thought that all of it, the Tefillah of Yom Kippur, I understand. We would have thought that many of those elements of what we say on Yom Kippur and throughout Slichot should be part of Rosh Hashanah as well. How far does this go? When we say Avinu Malkeinu, which will say, so how does Avinu Malkeinu begin? One of the very first lines we say, Avinu Malkeinu, Chatanu lefanecha, we've sinned before you. That is an expression of vidui, expression of confession. So there's a whole discussion in the poskim. Can you say that verse? Can you not say that verse? Is there a different meaning that one has to? That's how careful we are not about saying vidui. So on the one hand, we have this shofar, which is awakening us and is arousing us and is causing us to perform a tshuva and ask for mercy. But on the other hand, we know that none of that is actually in the machzor for Rosh Hashanah. So we have to think about why and how that is. Another idea of this called truah. Truah is a very, very interesting word. It's one of those things what we call an auto-antonym in English, right? Where it's like one word which has actually opposite meanings contained within the very same word itself. So truah on the one hand represents the brokenness, right? And represents that crisis, that broken heart as well. On the other hand, it's also a sound of joy. And the called Truah is the sound of the coronation of the king. Rav Sadia Gaon famously writes 10 different allusions for why we blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. And one of them is when, just as when the king ascends the throne a few years ago, we saw the coronation of the king, right? But when the king ascends the throne, you blow with trumpets and all sorts of things. So the sound of the shofar is that joyous call of the trumpets as well. Not the trumpets, but the shofar in this case. So on the one hand, it represents something which is very, very broken, represents the lowest point, the crisis. On the other hand, represents the joy as well. How do those two things come together? So you'll have to come on Wednesday again. Rabbi Rowe will be talking about that topic. Okay.
The word Torah
Yes.
An anagram of it's all there. I mean, the letters are all there, just as a bit more. So Orut and Torah are part and parcel.
Yes, that's right. I've never thought of that, but that's nice. Yeah. The Yom Yom is on Thursday. Did I say Wednesday? I apologize. The Yom Yom is on Thursday. You can come and learn on Wednesday as well if you want, but you'll have to do it independently. Okay. Thursday. The Yom Yom is on Thursday. Wednesday's at Nitzanim. All right. Okay. Another source that we have, and again, fairly well known, and it's always a risk when you say that a source or a Gemara or whatever is well known, because if you don't know it, then it's not well known. But I think it's fair to say, and I'm going to take the risk. Yeah. Gemara Masechet Rosh Hashanah Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph says, Amar Rabbi Abba Lama Tokin b'shofar sha'ayil. Why do we use specifically a ram's horn? I'm not going to get now into the technicalities and the details of what kind of shofar is kosher. It's not so relevant for most of us, because most of us just show up to shul on Rosh Hashanah and hope that whatever shofar the Baal Tokah has is a kosher one. Here it is, don't worry. But there is a whole discussion, and the Gemara goes into many details. According to the Rambam, it's only a shofar sha'ayil really that you should be using. According to everybody, shofar sha'ayil is the primary, the most mehudar. So says the Gemara, why do we have a shofar sha'ayil? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, tik'u lefanai b'shofar sha'ayil, kadei she'ezkor lachem akedat Yitzchak ben Avraham, u'ma'aleh ani alechem ki'ilu akadtem atzmechem lefanai. The shofar of the ayil, of the ram's horn specifically, reminds us of the Akedah. And we say when we blow the shofar with the ram's horn, so it reminds HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, of the Akedah, and it's as if we too are willing to perform that same level of self-sacrifice and devotion. Okay. So the question now is, the question which is discussed is, what actually is the definition of the mitzvah? There are two possibilities and a number of possibilities in between. Either there is a mitzvah to hear the shofar, or there is a mitzvah to blow the shofar, or like I said, or something in between. Now you'll say, well, obviously the mitzvah is to hear the shofar because everybody comes to hear the shofar. And it can't be that every single person has to blow the shofar themselves. What if I don't know? I don't know about you. I've tried a number of times. I've never really learned how to blow a shofar. Whenever I've held the shofar to my mouth, it says the sound does not come out. So it's not something that everybody can do. But we could say, nonetheless, it's still possible, conceptually, that the mitzvah is to blow the shofar, but we have mechanisms through halacha, through which one person is blowing the shofar and everybody else fulfills their mitzvah. Right? How could that be? It could be maybe the din of shlichut, right? There's a messenger who is performing it on our behalf, but we have to be there, we have to hear it. It could be what we call shomea ke'oneh, is a principle in halacha, where I hear something, it's as if I'm answering, it's as if I'm saying. Okay, so there are ways to explain it, meaning the fact that only one person is blowing the shofar on everybody else's behalf, that is not necessarily a proof for the fact that the mitzvah is to hear versus to blow. What would be the ramifications if the mitzvah is to hear versus to blow? For example, that's what we'll see in a moment, what bracha we say. But it could be, for example, let's say somebody blows the shofar, is in a situation where they blow the shofar, but they do not hear it. Have they fulfilled the mitzvah? How could that be? We'll get to it in a few moments. But if the mitzvah is to blow the shofar, it doesn't matter whether they hear it or not. They blow the shofar. If the mitzvah is to hear, so it's irrelevant that they blew the shofar, but they didn't hear it. Okay, so what is the bracha? So if you want to know what the bracha is, you open the machzor, right? But how did they know when they printed the machzor which bracha to print? So the Rambam in Echot Shofar writes as follows. He says, mitzvah taseh shel Torah, lishmoa truat ha-shofar b'Rosh Hashanah, shneimar, Yom Tuah Yeh Lachem. Again, notice that the Rambam emphasizes the fact that we have to hear the truah of the shofar. There are conditions for how to hear the truah. We have to know what the truah is, and we have to have the tkiyah before, and we have to have the tkiyah after. And it's all part of the package. The main thing is the truah. But he says again, he writes very clearly, mitzvah taseh shel Torah, lishmoa truah shofar. That's in halacha aleph. And halacha gimel, a little bit later, he writes, shofar gazul shetakabo yatsa. If you have a shofar that was stolen, this is not a good way to start the year by stealing things. But if for whatever reason you had a stolen shofar, he says you have fulfilled the obligation. She'ein mitzvah ela b'shmiyat hakol. Okay, we assume that since the mitzvah is only by listening to the sound, okay, and we say ein b'kol din gezel. There's no such thing as stealing a sound, and therefore that would be one would fulfill the mitzvah. In the Rambam's response, the Rambam wrote many responses, shelot v'tshuvot. So he was asked the following question: Ma ha'evdel ben nishmoa kol shofar uvein al tkiyat shofar. Okay, seemingly if we go back, it appears that there were different versions. There were different versions of the bracha. So those who said nishmoa kol shofar, and those who said al tkiyat shofar. Interesting. Also, it's not litkoa b'shofar; it's al tkiyat shofar. Okay. So he writes the Rambam, havdel benehem gadol meod. There is a very great difference between them. And you should know that the mitzvah is not to blow the shofar, but to hear the shofar. So we'll see some of the proofs brought back and forth why this should be. But important to know that it's not, as opposed to the Rambam, there are other Rishonim who hold, no, the mitzvah is not to hear the shofar, the mitzvah is to blow. The Rosh writes, Rabbeinu Tam Katav, sheyesh levalech al tkiyat shofar, mishum da'asiyata igma mitzvata. So he says the bracha is al tkiyat shofar. The Smag, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, the way he phrases it is, unlike the Rambam, he writes, Mitzvat aseh litkoa b'shofar b'Rosh Hashanah, shneimar Yom Tuah Yeh Lachem. Again, Mitzvat aseh litkoa b'shofar. Okay, so that seems to imply the difference. Probably the greatest proof for the fact that the mitzvah is lishmoa and not litkoa comes from the following case, which is brought in the Mishnah, and the Gemara explains. Hatokea letocha bol letocha dut. Somebody who is blowing the shofar into a pit or into a cave, etc. Right? You always learn Masechet Rosh Hashanah, we get to the Mishnah and say, why would you blow the shofar into a pit? So it's possible, remember, we've already spoken, why do we delay the blowing of the shofar to Musaf and not do it during Shachrit? Because there was a Shat HaShmat. There was a time when it was a sakana. People were not allowed to, there was a great risk and great danger in terms of publicly blowing the shofar and doing other mitzvot. So it could be there were situations people were hiding in caves, etc. And that's maybe where this came about. But in any event, so one who blows the shofar into a pit or into a cave, etc. Amar Avona, lo shanu elalotan haomdim al sfat habol, avalotan haomdim babol yatsu. In other words, what Ravana says over here, this is just a short excerpt of the Gemara, very, very complicated sugya. Part of the reason it's complicated is because it's been mistranslated many, many times. I'll explain in a moment. What the Gemara says is as follows. If somebody is blowing the shofar into the pit, okay, so it says anybody who's standing inside the pit and hears the shofar inside, they fulfill their obligation. There's no problem, right? The case is the person is standing on the edge of the pit and the shofar is going down into the pit, and that's where the sound comes out. So the Gemara says, if you were standing outside the pit and you did not actually hear the original sound of the shofar, but you heard the sound of the head, which is often translated as echo, which is probably a mistranslation. But it means there's a certain reverberation of the sound and you did not hear the original, the actual sound of the shofar, you have not fulfilled the obligation. And the case is, the person who is standing, who's blowing the shofar, where is he standing? He's standing outside. And therefore the Gemara says he has not fulfilled his obligation, even though he has blown the shofar. So that seems to be a very, very strong proof for the fact that the obligation is to hear and not to blow. This is what the Torah writes. He says, "Kodem sheyitka yivarech lishmoa kol shofar v'lo litkoa v'lav b'tkiyat aliyah milta." You should say the bracha of to hear the shofar and not to blow the shofar, because the mitzvah is to hear. כדתנן, התוקע לתוך הבור וכולי לא יצא. Okay, and that's the Mishnah. That's the Mishnah which we quoted. By the way, this question of blowing the shofar into a pit and hearing the original sound, not the original sound. So a few years ago, it's become very popular nowadays to perform scientific experiments to try and work out, right, whether, how that affects the halacha. So a few years ago in the journal Tchumen, it was published, there was a whole, somebody went and they I don't remember exactly how they did it, but they went into a closed room and they blew the shofar and they measured the decibels and the sounds, etc., and came out with a whole conclusion. The editors wrote either a footnote or a note at the end of that essay in which they basically said everything you've said is irrelevant, because it's very nice that you are going and you're measuring things scientifically and using all these instruments, but Torah lo nitna l'malachei hasharet. It's a principle that we have, that the Torah expects us to relate to things the way that human beings relate to, with the five senses, not the way you would relate to things in a laboratory. And this has many, many, many implications, different areas of halacha, most famously in the realm of kashrut. Right? So when it comes to kashrut, there was a whole question about checking food for bugs, etc. This relates to a little bit what I mentioned on Shabbat. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva. He talks about all these things. Nowadays, you have all these chumras checking things for bugs, which, for our parents and our grandparents, it was kosher, and suddenly for us it's not kosher. So again, sometimes there is really a difference. Sometimes there are new infestations and things which had not occurred before. One has to know, one has to understand what the reality is. In past generations, there were certain foods which people just avoided. You mentioned Pesach, I mentioned Maror. So karpas and maros, there are communities that would not use parsley or even lettuce or things. Potatoes, different potatoes for karpas. You don't use potatoes for maror, but potatoes for karpas. One of the reasons is A, they couldn't get other vegetables, but B, if they could, they were infested and they couldn't clear them of bugs. But why do I mention all of this? The insects that you have to search for, that you have to see, that would be forbidden to eat, are those that can be discerned with the naked eye, right? It may mean you have to look in the light. It may be difficult to see them, whatever. Okay, but you can see them. An insect which is at the side that cannot be seen by the naked eye, but can only be seen with the aid of a microscope, so that there's no prohibition against consuming that, and therefore one would not have to check again. If it's something which, under normal circumstances, if the bug was there by itself, you could see it. But because of the coloring and the camouflage, and now I need a magnifying glass in order to be able to see it on the leaf, so that's a different question. Okay, again, this is not a shiur chot kashrut, but I'm just mentioning the principle of lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharet. That's the idea. This is why, by the way, Aruch HaShulchan writes about this. Is very famous. Talks about when they discovered bacteria. So there's a question, what about, in the air that we breathe and in the water that we drink? There's also all the time, there's all sorts of microorganisms which do not chew the cud or have split hooves. And why are those, why is there no, so he writes, Lo nitna Torah lemalachei hasharet. So the same thing here, when there are things where you have to do scientific tests to discern, that's not what we're talking about. But essentially, so long as you hear the original sound, the actual sound of the shofar, that is fine. Where this does have implications nowadays, the question does come up from time to time. If somebody has obviously there won't be a question of a microphone, because nobody's using a microphone on Rosh Hashanah, but there is a question of a hearing aid. And there are those who say maybe when you use the hearing aid, you're not hearing the actual sound, but you're hearing. So suffice it to say that if somebody cannot hear without a hearing aid, then you should keep the hearing aid in and you hear the shofar. In other words, b'ma nafshach. Meaning, if you can't hear without it, so then you're patur from the mitzvah. And if you can hear only with it, so then that's how you fulfill the mitzvah, and that's fine. Somebody who can hear, somebody who uses a hearing aid to improve their hearing, but they can hear without it. Okay, in such a situation, would it be better to take out the hearing aid to listen to the shofar directly? Probably yes. But
some members, many members, are so prone that they don't use their hearing aids even during the week.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And we always have lost and found at the end of all the hearing aids that were taken out and weren't put back in, and when they were discovered, wherever they were discovered. Okay. But again, I want to emphasize the point that if one cannot hear without the hearing aid, one should not take it out. There's no point, and that's fine. Okay, one other point, one other possibility for this, which is we mentioned, it could be that there's a mitzvah to hear the mitzvah is either to hear the shofar or to blow the shofar. One of the proofs that's brought for those who say that the mitzvah is to blow the shofar rather than to hear the shofar is that the Mishnah says certain people who are not obligated, somebody who is a cheresh, somebody who's deaf or mute, right, is not does not have the obligation of the mitzvah of shofar, and therefore they would not be allowed to blow the shofar for others. So you can ask, if the mitzvah is to hear the shofar, why do I care that the person who's blowing the shofar is obligated or not? The person who's blowing the shofar has to be obligated, and maybe that's a proof that actually the mitzvah is blowing the shofar. If I say the mitzvah is blowing is litkoa, so now say the person who is blowing the shofar is performing the mitzvah, and I am fulfilling the mitzvah by hearing them by proxy or whatever mechanism. But if I say the mitzvah is simply to hear, so then anybody could, the person doesn't have to be, theoretically, you could say maybe the person doesn't even have to be Jewish. They can blow the shofar. What difference does it make? So we say no. What? You'd have to, yeah. Look, the Mishnah says, the fact is that however we understand the definition of the mitzvah, the Mishnah says that it has to be a person who is obligated in the mitzvah who has to blow for you. So the question is why? Isn't that a proof to say that actually the mitzvah is blowing and not hearing? So says the Chazon Ishna, that's not a proof, because you could say the mitzvah is to hear, but in what are you hearing? You have to hear a kol shofar, which is kasher. What is defined as a kol shofar? That is defined as somebody who has the obligation of the mitzvah of shofar, who's blowing and making that sound, and therefore that is not a proof. Ultimately, we probably assume that the mitzvah is hearing versus making the sound, and that is the bracha that we make. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Kodem shiitka yivalech lishmoa kol shofar v'yivalech shechianu." Okay, as we've said, we say shechianu on both days. Obviously, it's only the Baal Tokeh who's going to say these brachot. But everybody in the Kahal has in mind that the brachot are being said on behalf of me. I'm fulfilling my obligation, and therefore I say Amen. And therefore I don't say Baruch Hu Baruch Shmo either. There should be no interruption, and one should have in mind they're being included. A number of years ago, I was spent Yamim Noraim at a Gibraltar community, and I was going to say before the Tzkiat Shofar, I was going to say everybody has to answer Amen to the brachot. And since you are being obligated, this is part of your obligation as well, one should not answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shmo. And then I was told that the minhag in Gibraltar and in some Sephardic circles is that they do say Baruch Hu Baruch Shmo even for a bracha, for their own bracha. So I was good that I didn't say that, but that our custom is not. The simple understanding is that saying Baruch Hu Baruch Shmo in the bracha would be an interruption, would be a hefsek, and therefore one should not say it. What happens if, for whatever reason, you have to switch shofar halfway through, or you have to switch Baal Tokeh? Sometimes it happens that the Baal Tokeh simply cannot continue, and you need to ask somebody else. So there's no need to say a new bracha, because the first bracha applied for everything. Right, the one who says it has in mind that it's for the entire kahal, and it's for all of the tkiyot that will come along, and that has another nafkamin, another implication for us, for all of us who are listening, because the point is everybody who's listening to the shofar is part of the mitzvah. That's what the mitzvah that I'm fulfilling throughout the day, of hearing the shofar. And if the bracha, which I do not say, but I answered amen to, meaning it's as if I said it, that's Rat Shomea Kohen. Principle that we know is that one does not interrupt between a bracha and the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So let us see how far this goes, and how makpid one has to be, in fact, not making interruptions. It can be very, very challenging, especially when you have young kids and things like that. And I don't just mean so you can tell them to be quiet. But okay. So first of all, we have, and we'll just say briefly, we know that we have the two sets of the tkiyot. We've discussed at length, right? Tkiyot miyushav, tkiyot me'umad, which is always confusing because we stand for all of them. But the tkiyot miyushav are the first set, that is before musaf, and then the tkiyot me'umad are the second set, which we blow during musaf, during the brachot. That is kedei la'abev hasatan, as the Gemara says, and many different explanations given exactly what that means. The one who is blowing the shofar always has to stand, right? The Torah writes, that the one who's blowing the shofar always has to stand. Why? Dichtiv, he learns it from the pasuk that says Yom Trua Yeh Lachem. From the fact that it says Lachem, We have Gzera Shava, we have that word in a number of places. It also says Lachem regarding Svirata Omer, and by Svirata Omer, we learn that it has to be done standing, and therefore that it's Ketchafar has to be done standing, and therefore the one who's blowing the shofar needs to stand. The Mishnah Berurah writes, originally at Tzibur Vashomim Tzkiot Lo Tzruchum La'amod Mishum Kvod HaTzibur, because the honor of the community, they said originally the Tzkiot Miyushav, the first set, you don't have to stand for, everybody can sit and listen to. Again, the Sephardi practice to this day is still to sit. But עכשיו נהגו הציבור לעמוד כולם גם בשעת התקיעות שתוקין קודם מוסף, אף על פי שנקראים תקיעות מיושב. Even though they're called תקיעות מיושב, we stand for all of them. The nafkamina will be if a person feels weak or whatever, and a person is not able to. So for the Tzkiot Muhammad, really one should stand. But for the Tzkiot Miyushav, one was not able to and one sat, they still fulfilled their obligation. Okay, so regarding now interruptions and talking, etc., between these two sets, so we have to distinguish between interruptions during the Tzkiot Miyushav, the first set, between interruption between the Tzkiot Miyushav and the Tzkiot Muhammad, and again after the Tzkiot Muhammad versus the final 40 blasts as well. And again, as I mentioned a few days ago, you might have thought, since we say that the main Tzkiot are really the Tzkiot Muhammad, the ones that come with the brachot, you might have thought there it's more important not to have a hefsek. But the fact is that we say the bracha and then we fulfill the minimum obligation, at least, of the 30 tzkiot, the tzkiot miyushav, and therefore the most important place not to have any hefsek at all is between the tzkiot, between the bracha and those tzkiot. How far does this go? It goes to the extent that, as we know, when the Baal Tokeh blows beforehand, you have the Baal Makre telling him Tkiya, Shvarim, Trua, whatever, Tkiya, right, before each. So I remember in Yeshiva, therefore their first Tkiya, the Baal Makre would not announce it. He would say the bracha, and he would immediately start with the Tkiyas, that there was no hefsek at all, and then he would announce Shvarim, Trua, etc. Most places the custom is not like that. Most places you would call out even for the first Tkiyah. And again, since that is part of the mitzvah, and that is very much for the sake of the mitzvah, that is allowed. If to stand up and say anything else would not be. But that's but the point is that there are even those, so even that they would not interrupt in that way. So the Rambam writes, the same person ideally should blow the shofar in both. And one may not talk between the two sets of tkiyot. The Hagaot Maimoniot, which is printed when you have the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah, you have underneath these what's called Hagaot Maimoniot, which is not necessarily, sometimes it's commentary on the pieces which are brought in the Rambam, but sometimes it's different different Piskei Halacha, different dinim that are brought from other sources, other Ashkenazi sources. In a similar way, when you have the Shulchan Aruch and you have the Ramah bringing the Ashkenazi custom, so many times you have the Rambam and then you have the Hagaot Maimoniot bringing the customs of the Ashkenazi poskim there as well. So he quotes here Rabbeinu Simcha, and Rabbeinu Simcha writes as follows: Imsach hatokeh ben habracha uben haseder ad shemasayem kol haseder chozer umevarech k'mosach ben tefillah letefillah. So he says, if one spoke between the bracha and the next set of, or even before he completes the end of the set, seemingly the end of all the tzkiyot, he needs to go back and repeat the bracha, just like what? Chozer umevarech k'mosach ben tefillah letefillah. Ben tefillah letefillah means tefillin. Okay, let's just take a pause here and give a bit of background in terms of Hilchot Tefillin. When we have Tefillin Shel Rosh and Tefillin Shel Yad, Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin Shel Rosh. So the Gemara says there are two brachot. There's a bracha which one says on the Tefillin Shel Yad, which is La'aniach Tefillin, and there's a bracha which one says on the Tefillin Shel Rosh, which is Al Mitzvah Tefillin. Now we have a machloket exactly how to understand the Gemara, and therefore we have a difference between Ashkenazim and Sfardim as well. There are those who understand that those two brachot, that right, you have the bracha of the Tefillin Shel Yad, and you have the bracha of the Tefillin Shel Rosh. So you would always say two brachot. That's the Ashkenazi custom, with the exception of the Gra. The Vilna Gaon learns differently. He learns, like the other poskim who say, no, there's one bracha. It's all one mitzvah. When I say the bracha, when I put on the Tefillin Shel Yad, but if I interrupted between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh, then I would now have to go back and say a new bracha. So when I put on the tefillin shel rosh, then I would say a bracha. What bracha do I say? So I don't say the same bracha again. Therefore, tefillin shel rosh, the bracha is al mitzvah tefillin. Okay, so that's a difference of opinion as to whether we always are required to say that bracha or only if one interrupts. Interrupting, by the way, between tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad is not a simple matter. We saw a few weeks ago in the parasha, spoke about the milchama, spoke about the people who come back from the milchama, though somebody was afraid, doesn't go out to fight. The Midrash says, what is he afraid of? He's afraid of averot shebiado. He's afraid that he has sinned, and therefore he does not have the merit that he'll be saved in the milchama. What is the sin that we're afraid of? So there's an opinion that says he spoke between putting on tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. Okay, we need some thought, we need some study as to what really that represents. There is a deeper idea at play there. But in any event, so if you interrupt in the middle of the mitzvah, because it's all one mitzvah, I've not yet completed the mitzvah, I haven't finished until I've put on the tefillin shel rosh as well. Therefore, if I spoke in the middle, in between, I'd have to go back and say a new bracha. So says Rabbeinu Simcha, same thing, with the tkiyat shofar. You have one set of tkiyot miyushav, you have one set of tkiyot miyumat. You went and you spoke in the middle, you have to go back now and say a new bracha. Okay, if we are, we'll see. This is not the way that we're going to pass in the Ma'aseh at the end of the day. But this would affect anybody. This would not affect just the person who's saying that, because in theory, anybody could say the bracha. By the way, right? The Baal Tokeh, we said, is the one who said the bracha at the beginning, and has everybody in mind, and we all have in mind to be included in his bracha. But theoretically, I'm fulfilling the mitzvah by hearing the shofar. I could say the bracha myself. This is not a good idea. It's not a good idea because, first of all, we say Barov Am Hadrat Melech. One person says the bracha on behalf of everybody, and that's wonderful. The second reason why it's not a good idea is because if you decide, I'm going to be frommer than everybody else, and I'm going to say my own bracha for the shofar. Okay, well, you have to get the timing right. If you say it too early, then you've got a big hefsek between the time that you've said the bracha and the time you heard the shofar. If you say it too late, meaning if you start saying the bracha at the same time, and then the tokeh blows and then at the first millisecond of the tkiyah I didn't hear because I was still saying a bracha, well, you haven't heard the tkiyah, so you haven't achieved anything. Where it could be relevant is if somebody comes late to shul. Let's say somebody misses the tkiyot miyushav and they come in for musaf. Okay, so you only, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tkiyat shofar, you need to hear the minimum 30 blasts. So if you hear the malchut zichronot shofrot, you fulfilled your obligation, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Okay, so you weren't there for the tkiyot miyushav, therefore you missed the bracha. So then, in such a scenario, which would be appropriate that just before the person says that, just before you hear the tkiyah, you would say yourself the bracha. But again, one has to be very careful to say it and to finish it with the timing. Better than that is come on time to shul, and then you don't have to get into that problem. But essentially, so the Haggadah Maimonides is saying, according to Rabbeinu Simcha, if we paskin that between one set of tkiyot and another set of tkiyot, I have to say the bracha again. By the way, if it makes you very, very nervous that you're not going to get the timing right, you still fulfilled the mitzvah if you didn't have the bracha. You lost the bracha, but you still fulfilled the mitzvah. So, okay. But he says, if you would have to now say a new bracha because your bracha is no longer valid because you spoke in between. So that would mean, even though the Baal Tokeh didn't speak in between, if I spoke in between, I'd have to go back and say a new bracha, if we accept that halacha. So that is Rabbeinu Simcha, says Haggadah Maimonides, who's quoted him, he says, Shema Oson Olamar, Ad Shemasayim Sdarim Shemiyushav, She'az Yatsa Midei Kol HaSvekot. So he says, hang on, he says, I think that when he says, you would have to go and repeat the bracha, it doesn't make sense that I'm talking after the tkiyot miyushav, because the first set of the tkiyot miyushav, that's those first 30 blasts, we have a hidur that we have extra and we go up to 100. But once I've said the 30 blasts, I've fulfilled the mitzvah. So at least b'di'eved, if I interrupt or if I speak after those first 30 blasts, there's no need to go back and say the bracha because I have fulfilled the mitzvah. I've fulfilled all the hidurim, etc. But if in between the first set of tashrat and tashat I spoke, then seemingly that's what he says that you would have to repeat it. עוד כתב רבינו שמחה, שכשם שאין לתוקע להשיח בינתיים, כך אין לשומעין להשיח. Okay, he spells it out. Just as the one who is blowing the shofar should not interrupt, so to those who are listening should not interrupt. הואיל והתוקע הוא שלוחן ומוציאן, right, he is the השליח, he's fulfilling the mitzvah for us, ושלוחו של אדם כמותו, כאילו השומע עצמו תוקע, right, as if the one who's hearing is blowing, etc. Okay. So says the Shulchan Aruch, לא יסיח, לא התוקע ולא הציבור בין תקיעות שמיושב לתקיעות sheme'umad. One should not, so in other words, from the time of the bracha until the last set of tkiyot, of shofarot, one should not speak. One can obviously daven, one should daven, one can say the words of tefillah, that's fine, but one should not speak. Says the Rama, binyan tkiyot v'tfilot, and anything that you're saying that's regarding issues of the tkiyot or of the tefillah, that is acceptable. But if you spoke about unrelated things, you don't need to go back and say another bracha. Obviously, you should not speak between the bracha and the beginning of the tkiyot themselves, unless it relates to the last, for example, calling out tkiyah or something like that. The Mishnah Berurah, by the way, explains why we don't have to go back and say the bracha again, why it's not like the case of tefillin. He says, Lo dami lesach ben tefillah la tefillah, dahatam shtei mitzvot. Because there, it's two separate mitzvot. Tefillin shel yad, tefillin shel rosh. And therefore, one would have to say new bracha. Ma she'eno ken achad, kol achad mitzvah. Here is all one mitzvah. It's the mitzvah of tkiyat shofar, yom tshuva, etc. And therefore, even if within the middle of those first 30 blasts, one would go and speak, right, and interrupt, one does not need to go back and say a new bracha. If you spoke between the shvarim and the tra of the shvarim tra, and he found the time to speak in between there, there one would not. So if the Baal Tokeh, for instance, would speak between the shvarim and the tra, then according to everybody, that would not be valid, and you have to go back and do that again. Okay, one question which comes up, the Piskei Teshuvot writes, what if one needs to go to the bathroom at some point during Chazarat HaShatz, okay, and this is in before all the tkiyot are finished, would one be allowed to say the bracha v'asher yatsa? Or do you have to wait till the end? So he says, Binyan nevalech. I remember actually this happened once when I was in yeshiva, the person sitting next to me, I remember he had to go out and he came back in and he was so stressed the whole of tefillah, he hadn't learned the Piskei Teshuvot and he didn't know what to do because he couldn't say anything, because he couldn't do it, and he's like opening his, he was opening his siddur and he was pointing at it and he was going, and it was so stressed. I think that was his kavanah gone for the rest of the tefillah. So had he learned this Piskei Teshuvot, he would have known the answer, which is thus. Could one say the bracha of Asher Yatzar? Again, we said tefillot are fine, but this is not part of the seder tefillah. Before the tkiyot umad are finished, lemaseh hiskimu shal poskim latir levarach bekat Asher Yatzar kevan shedin zeh tisur sicha ad achet tkiyot umad lo muskar b'gemara. At the end of the day, this din of not speaking until after tkiyot umad is not brought in the Gemara; it's brought in the Rif and the Rambam and the Rosh, but therefore, he says, "Lachen dinoka kedin hafsaka ben baruch shama lishtabach." Just like during Pesukei Zimra, it's brought in the Mishnah Berurah that one could say the bracha v'asher yatzar, and therefore he says, "Kol shekem b'tfilat Rosh Hashanah she'arukahi," tfilat Rosh Hashanah, which is long. You might have noticed. Therefore, that is allowed. By the way, if you think that tfilat Rosh Hashanah nowadays is long, remember a few years ago during COVID, it was amazing. There was this letter that was going around. Many people discovered of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, going back during the cholera epidemics, and they had all these questions of, limiting how many people would come into the shul and cutting things out, and it was a very similar situation we were in. So one of the things he said was something about the piyutim, etc. I don't remember now the exact language, but it might have said to omit certain piyutim or not, but it said that the tefillah should be shortened and it shouldn't be more than 5 hours. That was the shortened version. So these are not new things. Okay. But another question, I mentioned this the other day, of a hefsek, which might come up, is you'll see in the siddurim are printed, right? There's a vidui and there's a hiratzon that appears in between the different sets of the first 30 blasts themselves. So there is a difference of opinion as to whether this is allowed or not. And again, part of what it depends on is how we view these 30 tkiyot. The general probably the most common view is, why are we blowing 30 tkiyot? Because we're not sure how to get to the 9 that's required from the Torah. We're not sure what the Torah said Yom Truah. What does Truah mean? Does it mean Truah? Does it mean Shvarim? Does it mean Shvarim Truah? The Gemara says it can't be Truah Shvarim. That's not the way people cry. The way people cry is either like a Shvarim or like a Truah or like a Shvarim Truah. That's it. So we have a doubt. So if we have a doubt as to which one it is, so I have not fulfilled the mitzvah on a basic level until I have blown all the first 30 blasts, and therefore no interruption from the bracha until the end. If we accept the view of Rav Hai Gaon, who said that actually there's no doubt at all, there's no doubt, but on Rosh Hashanah we are trying to avoid machloket. Okay, you see this throughout the halachot of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we do everything that we can to avoid machloket. It's very, very interesting. And that's maybe one of the reasons why Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the only chagim that are celebrated for the same amount of days in the entire Jewish world, right? Between Israel and the diaspora, everywhere Rosh Hashanah is 2 days. Wasn't always like that. By the way, there were times in Eretz Yisrael where Rosh Hashanah was 1 day, but nowadays it's 2 days everywhere. Yom Kippur, everywhere is 1 day. Also, wasn't always like that. It's brought in the Ramah that there were places where they would try and fast for 2 days, and they stopped doing that. Rabbi Wine told me once because they couldn't survive. You try and fast for 2 days, it will not go well. Anyway, but that's what we have. And I think there's an idea there of the unity and avoiding any as much machloket as we can relating to these days. But anyway, so Rav Hai Gaon says, no, Truah, it's not that we don't know what it is from the Torah, it's that it could be, it's the Torah said Yom Truah, however you cry. If you want a Shvarim, Yatzata Yedei Chovah. You want a Truah, Yatzata Yedei Chovah. You want a Shvarim Truah, that's fine. But then Rabbi Abahu in Caesarea came along and said, this isn't right. Everybody's going to be doing their own different types of, people are going to say, where do you think it's a problem nowadays? What kashrut do you follow? What tkiyot do you follow? These guys have got the badatz tkiyot. These guys have got the Reuben tkiyot, right? These guys have got the shvarim truah. No, everybody's going to do the same. Okay, wonderful. So everybody does the same. But that means that, so why do we blow 30? Not because there's a doubt, not because we're not sure. All of them are fine. So seemingly, once I've said the bracha and I've blown the first set of 9, the first set of 12, right, then already I've fulfilled the basic mitzvah. So then I could interrupt. So you could say, if I follow, except if I go on, then to say the vidui after, for the Baltka wants to stop and say the hiratzon after the first set of Tashrat, that would be seemingly acceptable. Unless we say the following thing. We say it may be true that intrinsically you fulfilled the mitzvah after that first set. I don't have to get to all 30. But once Rabbi Abahu made that enactment, and now that we say that everybody does 30, so actually no, I've not fulfilled the basic mitzvah because Rabbanan have come along and established you have to have the 30. So that's the machloket that we have regarding whether the Baal Tokah could say this video and the Sihir Ratzon in between. The Mishnah Berurah writes, certainly one who's not the Baal Tokah, the rest of the tzibur that's listening, even if your Baal Tokah does say these things, you should just stand there quietly. Right? Hatfilot en hefsek, he says, Otzono lomar, depend kiyot miyushav lemu'mad shali lekatril la'asiach me'inyanam. He says, all right, between the tkiyot miyushav and me'umad, you can speak regarding the tkiyot. He says, now, ayen derech ha'chayim, sheda'ato debein ha'bracha ad sof ha'tkiyot miyushav, asur la'afsik afilu b'tfilot. Even right, until we get to the end of the first 30, there should be no interruption whatsoever. Lachen lo yamar yiratzon bas b'machzolim ben atkiyot demiyushav like yehalhel b'libo va'al yotzi b'fiv. He says he can look and he can think about the words of the yiratzon, but he should not say them. Or shomai yiratzon achal gmal atkiyot demiyushav. Or after he's finished the first 30 blasts, then he could say the yiratzon. And then the Sharat Zion, this is the Sharat Zion that I mentioned on Shabbat, which again, I think it's very, very interesting. So he quotes here, the Mishnah Berurah says one should not say these Yiratzot in between the Tkiyot, and he quotes in the Sharat Zion, Dat Kagaon Molein Alav Rabbi Yaakov Emden Besidro Lakel Bazeh. He quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was maker, who was lenient on this. Uledato Kavanat Magen Avam Ulachmir Rak Bain Bracha Letkiyah, V'ken Makom Shnoagim Ken En Limchot Biyadam. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, even though my preference is that the Baal Tokah should not be interrupting within the first 30 blasts and should not be saying these Yiratzons, since Rav Yaakov Emden writes in his Siddur that you can, therefore, Ein Limchot, one should not protest against those who have the practice to do so. Again, not before, not immediately after the bracha, but after each set. Now, what we mentioned on Shabbat, and Asol Rabbi Shavai brings in his Siddur, which is fascinating. He says there's a problem here. He says it's impossible that Rabbi Yaakov Emden actually said to say this. Because although it's printed in his Siddur, if you look in the original version of the Siddur, it's not printed. And how do we know that it was not Rabbi Yaakov Emden who added it, but it was the publishers? We always have to be careful of the publishers, right? Who added it in later on. First of all, it's not in the original version, which clearly the Chafetz Chaim did not have access to. But if you look at what those tefillot are saying, right, and they mention the malachim who are bringing out tkiyot and doing things, and there's sort of, right, so we have a whole shiur on Shabbat in terms of this. I'm not going to repeat that, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden was very opposed to that. So clearly he could not have said it. So we see that the takala that comes out of this, that it comes to a point where the Chafetz Chaim himself in the Sha'ar Tzion says there's a halachic ramification based on the fact that these passages were printed in the Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden never included them, and he never allowed it. So would he still have said that, or would he have chosen harsher terms had he seen the original copy? We can speculate. Okay. But basically, where this comes from is really, according to the Kabbalah, the Arizal introduced these phrases. According to the Zohar, it's important to say these phrases, and there's no problem of interrupting. And that is what Rav Ovadia writes here as well. He quotes that. There's an interesting idea. Rav Ovadia says, he quotes a certain logic. He says maybe there is a sveika to allow to say that. He says, what is a sveika? He says, number one, he says maybe that Acha actually follows Rav Hai Gaon. So there's no safek at all. So the first safek is that there's no safek, right? But that therefore one has fulfilled one's obligation after fulfilling the first set. And the second safek is that maybe even if the halacha is not like Rav Hai Gaon, that the first set, that the tashrat is the one where I fulfilled my obligation. Then he rejects that because that's not really a fake. It's really all the same. It's really all the same safek, which is whether I fulfilled obligation after that. Okay. Just to end off, last topic we have here is about women and the mitzvah of shofar. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Isha Torah mishum davei mitzvah taseh shazman grama. Very simply, it says the Shulchan Aruch, women are exempt from the mitzvah of shofar because it is a positive time-bound mitzvah. Nonetheless, writes Rabbi Akiva Eiga in his response, should Rabbi Akiva Eiga, לזה נראה, זה באמת אינן בחיוב מצווה זו, כיוון דווי זמן גרמה. He says it's correct, it's a time-bound positive mitzvah, therefore there is no obligation. אלא, דמכל מקום רוב נשי דידן מחמילין לעצמן. He says most of our women are machmir. I think that's probably the case today as well. Many women are machmir to come and hear the shofar. וזהירות וזריזות לקיים רוב מצוות עשה שהזמן גרמן. Interesting. He says they are most of the time-bound mitzvah they try and fulfill. כגון שופר סוכה לולב וכן בקידוש יום טוב והווה כקיבלו עליו. Not going to get into all the parameters now, but there is some of the mitzvot. To what extent, if this has become a very universal custom, to the extent that women are always go and fulfill it, maybe we could say they've accepted upon themselves, and therefore they would, in a sense, become obligated. But nonetheless, it seems to me there does not seem to be a formal obligation, but better to try and go and to hear the shofar. And as we've mentioned, that would be the requirement would be to hear the minimum 30 blasts, not necessarily 100. There is discussion here regarding the bracha. Again, for the Shulchan Aruch, it's more complicated because according to the Shulchan Aruch, a woman is not obligated in a positive time-bound mitzvah. Therefore, how could she say the bracha? Asher kedushan of a mitzvotav. According to the Ramah, we say no. We say even if there is no obligation, there is still reward, and it's still they're allowed to perform, and therefore they are allowed to say the bracha. The custom nowadays is that if you have a shofar blowing for women exclusively, then one of the women will say the bracha. Again, if the man who is blowing the shofar, let's say, the man who is blowing, if there is no woman who knows how to say the bracha, so the man who is blowing the shofar, if he's already fulfilled his obligation, since the women are not actually obligated, he's allowed to blow again for them, but he's not allowed to say the bracha because he's not fulfilling any obligation. Now, if a man who's already heard the shofar, let's say somebody goes to a hospital to go and blow the shofar for different people, so there's different men in some of the wards, so he can blow the shofar 5 times. He could say the bracha 5 times, so long as each of those individuals are obligated. But since the woman does not have a formal obligation, he cannot say the bracha for them, unless he has not fulfilled the mitzvah himself, and therefore when he is saying the bracha, he has the intention that it's also for his obligation, also for this. So you could theoretically, this is a very strange case. You could theoretically have a case where a person is about to go in shul in the morning, and he has intent that he's not going to have in mind to fulfill the obligation for himself, but only for everybody else. And after he goes, he says the bracha. Again, that's complicated. We would try and avoid that for many reasons. So either if he's blowing for them the first time before. Right. Normally, you have the additional shofar blowing after davening, but you could have the additional shofar blowing before davening, and then you could say the bracha. Or one of the women who is hearing and who is fulfilling their obligation that way would say the bracha, and then as soon as they're finished, then the man would blow the shofar. As we've said, the whoever is fulfilling the mitzvah, whoever's hearing the shofar, can say the bracha. It doesn't have to be the one who is blowing. Okay. The last thing, Rav Vadia, he does note here that if a woman has accepted upon herself to hear the shofar every year, so then that becomes an obligation, and then she would have to, if she for whatever reason is not able to, let's say in certain years she's with young kids at home as a baby or something, and she's not going to be able to get to shul, she's not going to be able to hear the shofar, so then she would have to do hatarat nedarim. But that's in such a case, and therefore it's always a good idea to say you're coming through, bli neder, but yeah, we always perform the hatarat nedarim before Rosh Hashanah anyway. So he says if there is such a case, says Rabbi Vadia, then the woman should ask her husband to have her in mind for the hatarat nedarim on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and therefore she would not be obligated in that sense to hear the shofar. Okay, Adkan, that's it for today. Wishing everybody a k'tiva v'chatima tova. And next year will be next year after Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.